well, because I think SEPs were not, there was not much oversight in the past, and so they were seen as a kind of an easy way out, and now they're part of a penalty, and so sometimes it's just better to go straight to the cleanup and abatement and take care of it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Each of the regions has a unique culture and a unique perspective on SEPs and their value. And so those that have come to the cleanup and abatement account and use that vehicle, it's an excellent vehicle, as you know, for high quality projects. And yet, the way SEPs are going in the regions these days, it can also be an excellent vehicle for regional projects that are pre-vetted.
And speaking of the cleanup and abatement account, do we have information? And now I'm actually on our performance report now on the Enforce tab. Do we actually have information on the projects that the cleanup and abatement account fund?
The annual performance report does not include information on the specific projects that are funded, no.
So how are we to convince people, especially regional boards, that feel their SEPs and their accounts are better than going to the cleanup and abatement account? How do we demonstrate that projects funded through the cleanup and abatement account are effective and efficient?
I think Liz may have had a comment.
Hi, Liz Haven with the Division of Financial Assistance. I don't think I can answer your specific question about, more about the performance, but as far as the approval of the projects, I do want to point out that in addition to the ones the board approves, the ones that are delegated to my position are included in the executive director reports. So that's not fully responsive to your question about performance, and that's something we could work with the Office of Performance to address. But I did want you to know that's how we publicize the projects that are approved.
Thank you. I think just a tickler for Karen and Rafa and Orp, looking at the Enforce tab of our enforcement report, I think it would be very helpful to have additional information about the cleanup and abatement account and the SEP projects. In fact, I just pulled up the 2012 SEP annual report, which is essentially a spreadsheet, and I strongly encourage you to work with Rafa to incorporate it into the performance report.
Very good. So we can see, I wanted to report too on some trends by the type of project we're looking at. We've done a lot of private lateral replacements and low impact development projects are on the upswing. We had a very large project approved that was a replacement water project for the people of Hinckley at the grade school, where they're now drinking clean water that's coming, or not yet drinking, but will soon be drinking water that's being pumped and treated to their grade school, as opposed to having bottled water provided by the responsible party. And then some areas where we're seeing projects decrease are in restoration, education, and monitoring studies. But again, the increases and decreases in the types of projects, it's a little bit early to be predicting trends since we've only got 2 years worth of data, and so we're still kind of picking up the broader trends on what are the types of projects that dischargers are willing to pick up and fund with SEP money. Overall, though, projects with the direct water quality benefit...
I'm sorry, Chris, just a quick question on those trends. I'm surprised that education is dropping. Is it dropping because they're not interested or because we're not interested?
I think it's...
Because I know it's one of those things where sometimes people think that a defendant or a permittee, a discharger, doing education is sort of getting the glory when they actually did something bad, but the fact of the matter is none of us have enough money put into education.
So two parts of that. The SEP policy requires now, even with education projects, that any promotion by the responsible party or discharger has this disclaimer saying this is being funded as part of an enforcement action against me.
Good.
So that was one thing that didn't happen prior to the adoption of the policy, or didn't universally happen. It was a good idea, so we require it all the time now. Let's see, to your point on education going down, I think that it's it's viewed as having less of a direct impact on water quality. And I just haven't seen any proposals come forward. So I'm not persuaded yet that we're not going to see those come forward when we see good ideas. It just could be one of those things where we just haven't seen a good one in the near term.
Okay.
Or in the near past.
Thanks.
Before you move forward, Chris, refresh my memory, it's been a while, but I believe as part of the SEP policy, the regional boards either are required or requested to identify and post on their web pages a list of priority issues or areas where they would encourage SEPs to be focused. Is that being posted, and is there an easy way to access that?
Most of the regions have SEP lists, preferred sort of pre-vetted SEP lists. Some are very heavily vetted, and so they're really promoting those, like the Region 3 lists and also in Region 2. Others are if it meets the nexus criteria, the board's gonna authorize it, and they have a very broad list. More and more, the enforcement coordinators and the AEOs, when I meet with them, are looking at using the pre-approved SEP list as a way to fund larger SEP projects where a certain discharger may be able to fund just a milestone or a chunk of that project. So they're looking at ways to vet high-quality projects in their region and promote those where a discharger might have more of an opportunity to feel safer about making sure it gets completed. So yeah, I think with one exception, I think all of the boards now have pre-vetted SEP lists that are current, and the other is in the process of developing that list.
It would be very helpful if that could be compiled or the links put into one page. I'm on your Office of Enforcement webpage, and there's no easy way to access that, I assume, unless I'm going to go to each regional board's website and do a search and look for it that way.
Yeah, I think that'd be an excellent link for our board, and it shouldn't take us too long to get that.
And that way, it
completed.
should give us an idea of what the regional boards feel are important, and perhaps get some idea about trends there.
And once again, I think the regional boards are assessing the staff costs, the staff time that it takes to oversee these, because for the cleanup and abatement projects, sometimes they're quite large and are truly cost effective. When you get into SEP projects, which may be smaller, it really gives everyone pause, I think.
Okay. As I mentioned, we're seeing a lot more projects with direct water quality benefits. And really, when the SEP policy came out, the pendulum swung really dramatically in this direction. And now, as we've been working with the policy, we're seeing some more projects proposed that have an indirect quality benefit, data gathering type projects that would benefit all of our programs, including the one where the violation arose under. And so we did this little report card. Most of the policy's objectives were fairly straightforward and self-implementing upon adoption of the policy. We just had to make sure that everyone was following through on what was required. We still have some work to do on making sure that we're capturing staff costs in an efficient, fair, and equal manner across the regions. And we see that overall, it appears that the quality of SEPs is improving, but the jury's still out to some extent on that while we gather more data. And I'm sure I'll be reporting back to you in a few years on how that trend has continued or whether it has. So
You might consider replacing the number 5 check with a
I'm going to put a
plus
question
check or
until I can
something,
answer
right?
how we look at that.
Exactly, because because that can be followed up on, and if it's not completely true, that would be a problem.
Any further questions? Thank you.
No, just thank you, Chris, and I will just ask Tom to just sort of, actually let me rephrase this. I think it's very helpful to report back to the board on how our policies that we adopted are implemented, and whether or not there, are changes that staff would recommend, or areas that you would look into for improvement. I mean, we go through, and it's always nice to get a policy adopted, but it's even nicer to hear back in a few years and check in and see how it's working out, and whether or not, we'd need to do some adjustment along the way. Because sometimes, we very rarely make mistakes, but sometimes we may think something would work out a certain way and perhaps it doesn't. So I think these little policy check-in is very helpful.
Thank you both. Mr. Howard, would you introduce informational item number 6, please?
So the Delta Water Master reports periodically to the board on his activities, and Craig Wilson, the Delta Water Master, is here to fulfill that.
And since there's nobody in the audience with pitchforks, I think you must have been relaxing, Craig.
I think there's probably thousands of people listening in on the webcast.
Ah, okay.
Exactly. Good morning, members of the board. My name is Craig Wilson. I'm the state's Delta Water Master, and I'm here today to present just a very brief update of some of the more recent activities of our office. I'm starting off with a very positive vein. I'm pleased to introduce a new staff member. She's here today in the front row. Her name is Christy Klein-Rico. Right there. Not only is Christy have a very sound scientific background and some good work experience, but she's in essence a third-generation farming family person. Both her parents and her grandparents own farming operations in Yolo and Sutter counties, and she's worked on the family farms for many, many years. And I think it'll be very useful in advising me on some of the agricultural diversions in the Delta, and she'll have kind of an instant rapport, I think, in talking with people down there, so we're glad to have her on board. Pursuant to the Water Code, the board has delegated the Water Master Office authority in 2 basic areas, one dealing with informational gathering and monitoring, and the second dealing with compliance and enforcement. And I want to go into some of our recent activities in both of those categories. Regarding informational gathering, that's basically trying to answer the question that was relatively uncertain at the time the Water Master Office was established. How many people are actually diverting water in the Delta, and how much water is being diverted. And I think we're getting a pretty good handle on how many people are actually diverting water in the Delta through statements that have been filed with the board pursuant to new laws, pursuant to some of the progress and annual reports from our permittees and licensees. We have documentation of approximately 2,600 diversions taking place in the Delta, and over 2,100 of those are actually from not permittees and licensees of the board, people that hold other water right claims, such as riparian water rights, pre-1914 water rights. We still occasionally are getting new people into the system, people that just haven't gotten the word that the riparians that have to file statements with the board, and so we get that documentation in. And quite frankly, I think there might be actually a contraction in that number taking place in 2013 as people realize some of the new monitoring requirements that are being placed on them. I think they'll probably try to consolidate some of these statements, like where there's an irrigation district or a reclamation district that's making the initial diversion, and some of the individual people diverting after that could be considered rediversions and not really subject to filing their own statements. So there may be actually a slight lowering of this number. But of the people in the Delta and in the system, there are various reporting requirements. Permittees and licensees have to file annual reports. People subject to the statements programs file reports once every 3 years. And we've been placing a great deal of effort in trying to get compliance with these reporting requirements so we get an accurate information on people. And in 2012, the reporting year, we actually had, of the 360 people that had reporting obligations, we ultimately received reports from 359 out of 360. The one lone holdout has been issued a cease and desist order and a rather hefty fine. I'm not sure what will happen with it, but our staff has really done a good job getting that information in. And I think getting that information in is really important in our efforts to try to establish an effective database. What we're doing is taking the information from these statements, from these progress reports, plotting diversion points, basically giving a snapshot of each island and tract in the delta, where you can go to that island and tract to see exactly where the diversions are, linked to the statements, linked to the progress reports if there's any enforcement and compliance activity. So I think that's an important step in providing more certainty regarding.
Is that in the ERIMS database, or?
Yes, most of it is in the ERIMS. Most of it is in the intranet site. We have a special designated area for the Delta. It's, as you know, it's a statewide program, but now you're able to go and look at the Delta. I hope eventually we'll be able to have separate designated areas for virtually every tract and island in the Delta, so people can quickly link to a particular area and be able to get good information on what type of diversions are taking place.
Craig, where you're making significant progress on that facet of your responsibility, how do you deal with the uniqueness of the Delta? I mean, so much of what was trying to be gathered, I suppose, was aside from this perception that 99% of the people in the Delta were diverting illegally, and we won't go through all that, but we kind of know where it came from and what the motivation was behind it. But aside from that facet of this, the Delta is unique in that when you look at other agriculture areas in the state, you have water diversions that are tied to some type of consumptive use. You have some degree of discharge that is in excess of the consumptive use, which will never fine-tune something to where every molecule of water is consumptively used, and we don't use any more than that. But in the Delta, you've got all of the seepage issues, and I realize not every island is created equal, and I would hate to be the one that had to give a presentation on which were which as far as the amount of seepage because of their relative elevations due to to sea level. The peat type soils on some are more extensive than others. So you've got diversion, you've got consumptive use, but you've got on a lot of these an inordinate amount of return flows, which aren't necessarily bad. They're just kind of indigenous to that area. How do you, that seems like it's going to have to be sort of a next step, because you've completed the reasonable portion of it as far as identifying the diversions, but more so than any other part of the state that I can think of, the return flows go back into a net use of water, if you will.
Mr. Chairman, I think it's a perfect segue into what I was going to be talking about.
I was trying to be helpful as
next.
always, that.
That was a very helpful question, because in 2013, as you probably know, there's some new water measurement requirements that are being placed on holders of statements. And the Delta people were first brought into the statement program in 2010, so their next reporting cycle is this year. And not only will we be dealing with a lot more numbers of people and having to identify and go through their reports, but this new diversion measurement requirement comes into effect. One of the things I think it's lacking in is that it requires people to report on how much water they're taking out of a water course, and it's not really getting as much to this net water use issue. I've talked with the Division of Water Rights staff as to whether we could possibly amend the statements form to cover not only the statutory requirements of the statement program, which talk about how much water is actually being diverted out of the water course, but get to this question of net water use, because you're absolutely right that the unique factors of the Delta, some of the ones you listed, in addition to those, just the tidal influence that you've always got water in the Delta, regardless if it's a very dry year or a very wet year, because of this tidal influence. So it's going to be a little bit difficult moving beyond the legal requirement of them telling us how much water they're taking out of the water course to get to this kind of net water use. But we're hoping to maybe get to the form, use our existing authority to acquire more general monitoring information to perhaps get to some of these questions, because how much water they're taking out of the system is obviously only one part of the equation, particularly in the Delta.
No, and they're not the only ones. I mean, you and I have had this discussion, Vicki and I have had the discussion. some water districts, particularly in areas where drainage is of better quality than others, let's say, may have a negligible, it won't come out, you know what I mean. I must have bitten my tongue last night. But the difference between what's being diverted and what's being returned may be of little consequence, quite frankly, as long as the quality is good, because some of them are tied to, you know, reclamation activities because of soil type, and because they're in a, you know, there's other areas in the Delta that are essentially in a captive basin that must, you know, collect drain water and natural accretions and what have you, and rainfall, and return them into the system, where the ground's essentially rendered useless because, you know, of high conate water. So I mean, to me, it's an interesting facet of what we're doing, and I think you've acknowledged if we just look at the diversion, it's only part of the story. So, and then you tie quality back into that, and it really gets to be difficult as well. If there's not a significant degradation of quality, there's no harm, no foul. But then, you know, there again, not all drainage is created equally. So.
But getting back to 2013, like I indicated, the vast majority of the Delta diversions will be reporting on their water use in 2013, including this new water measurement requirement. And we're doing quite a bit of outreach to try to make people fully aware of this program. You know, the Division of Water Rights came out with a notice already of the reporting requirement that's due this July. Mentions the water measurement requirements. We held a workshop down in the Delta last fall. We're going to hold at least 2 more in the spring, probably come up with a final reminder to try to make people aware of this water measurement requirement, because even though it only deals with net water use now, I think with diversions, I think it'll at least give us some handle on how much water is actually being used in the Delta. It won't be the final answer, but it will be a start.
And what kind of costs, I know that was a big discussion that we had when we were first getting into this idea of requiring measurement. What kind of costs are the farmers incurring to do this? I mean, is it a wide range from, you know, what's the range?
Well, it's kind of interesting. The way the law was set up, it was written basically saying that, and this is statewide, not just the Delta, that people will measure their water use using the best engineering available and best engineering practices. But then there was kind of an out where the law said that where installation of things such as, you know, flow meters were not locally cost effective, then people could provide some sort of alternate measurement. My indication with talking with people, I think a lot of people, you know, did not install meters, did not actually measure their water use during 2012. So how are they going to comply? I think there are ways that they can do after the fact type analyses, either using pumping records if they have pumps. There's ways to do statistical analysis based on the size of the farming operation, what crops were irrigated, when, what types, how much acreage, and you can put all those numbers into these software programs, and out pops I believe a reasonable estimate of how much water was used in the irrigation. So I suspect a lot of people will probably be engaging in things like that. I don't think it's cheap, but it's certainly less expensive than installation of flow meters, especially for the smaller diverters.
Member Spivey Weber, if I can point out as well that the web page for the Division of Water Rights was updated over the last number of months to provide a pretty useful, easy, accessible way to get at information on the reports, on how to measure your diversion, how to report online, et cetera. So a lot of thanks to the division staff and those that help them, but it's a really easy to use web page now.
Great, thank you.
So just to wrap up on the informational gathering, I think we're making progress, and I think eventually we'll be getting to a situation where the information we've gathered might set the stage, which I think is the ultimate way to provide certainty, which is perhaps some type of an adjudication of delta diversions, and the information we're gathering now may lay the groundwork for that type of activity, which would probably last many, many years if other adjudications are any indication. So turning to compliance and enforcement activities, you can break it down kind of into two categories. The in-delta diversions, the 2,600 people diverting water within the legal delta, but the Water Master Authority also extends to permittees and licensees of the board to the extent that their diversions may affect conditions in the delta. So regarding in-delta diversions, we're continuing a job that was established by the board in its 2008 strategic plan and was initiated by the Division of Water Rights. You can call it island hopping, if nothing else, where you're basically going from island to tract and comparing the information we have on file regarding from the statements, programs, from the annual reports of the permittees and licensees, seeing what people have said that they're doing and comparing it to like aerial photos, other evidence, materials from the Department of Fish and Game, and seeing if any compliance issues are raised. The most typical one would be where you have information where a parcel within the interior of one of these islands is irrigating water. There doesn't appear to be a water course connection, yet the people are claiming a riparian right. And what we would do in that situation is contact the individual diverter, ask them about their situation, say that we have these questions, and then go from there. Sometimes they can document the water right by showing that there's an historical slough connection that's still retained, or that there was evidence at the time the parcel was severed from the water course that there was an intent to retain the riparian right. If that's the case, we close the file and don't exercise any discretion to take enforcement action. In other cases, we may go forward with enforcement. Regarding the outside of delta diversions, the permittees and licenses that affect the delta, the two main areas I've been dealing with are the major projects, the State Water Project of the Department of Water Resources and the Central Valley Water Project from the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. And as you know, their water rights were issued to ensure compliance with the Bay Delta Water Quality Plans and their various flow standards, pulse flow standards, salinity objectives, export limits. There's a whole myriad of requirements, and we've been placing an increased emphasis on seeing if the projects are complying with these. We've been out dealing with southern salinity issues and how the Department of Water Resources is able to operate some of the barrier systems in the south to improve circulations. We've also had issues with the Bureau of Reclamation regarding some of the pulse flow requirements. I'm meeting later this month with the project's proponents to see if we're able to reach agreement on how the Bureau and the Department of Water Resources are going to comply with the board's pulse flow standards this spring. We'll see how that goes.
What do you do in a situation where they simply cannot?
Where they physically cannot?
Physically cannot.
If you got to that situation, I think a lot of this involves enforcement and compliance discretion, and you would look at all the facts, you'd hear from all the other sides, and if you reasonably concluded that they were making a reasonable effort to comply with the standards and permit requirements, I think you would ultimately conclude you could exercise enforcement discretion to either nudge them as close as possible, work them as close as they can get. But if you felt they've done everything reasonable, then I think you would probably get to a point where you would exercise discretion to say that that they've done all that could reasonably done to comply.
Craig, to that point, I mean, there are varying opinions on the extent of sea level rise and the time frames associated with it, but clearly there are sea level rise activities that we've seen in recent history. If they continue, who do you see in your mind that you hold responsible for changes in delta salinity that are from seawater intrusion, not coming from the other end, but we're only going to have the luxury of a hydraulic hammer to a certain point, and then at some juncture it would seem that we'll have to change those standards and expectations.
Yeah, I'm certainly not going to try to substitute my judgment for the elaborate process that the board's going through right now to look at some of those issues in connection with your updates to your Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. But it's certainly right that you have to consider all the factors that are affecting beneficial uses, some of which are, can be under the control and influence of some of the upstream diverters and dischargers, but there's others that are naturally occurring, the tidal events, the sea level change, and I think what you have to do is just balance those types of factors and see, what can reasonably be required of parties to the extent that they may be, part of the issue, part of the problem. But again, you have a multi-year effort underway to try to get to those questions. So I don't think I can really comment too much more than say that.
Trying to bait you into something, but I guess it seemed that way, didn't it?
No, let me just ask, in the current, I understand, and I need to look into it more carefully, that the current Bay Delta plan requires people who are using the Delta or using water from the Delta to have a sea level or a climate vulnerability. Here I am with your my tongue. Report or plan. If they are vulnerable to climate issues, what's the plan for dealing with that over time? Are you familiar with that? That in the I know it's a draft right now and it hasn't been adopted, but are you familiar with that aspect of the Bay Delta plan?
I have not been too involved in that. I was going to mention this later in my update. As you know, the Delta Water Master submits policy level reports regularly to both the board and to the Stewardship Council. One report, I think the very next report I'm going to be filing, is dealing with gates and barriers in the Delta, various artificial means to try to deal with some of the hydrodynamic issues. And some of those deal with salinity, some could potentially deal with sea level issues. And so I'll be bringing a report to you that talks about some of those. It kind of nibbles at the edges of your question because I have not dealt too much with climate change vulnerability issues.
Thank you.
Just briefly to wrap up, one other activity, if people are interested, on the board's website, on the home page, there's a link at the bottom to the Delta Water Master Office, and we've improved and updated that link quite a bit. It contains a lot of information on our activities if anybody's interested in seeing that. And then lastly is this reporting obligation. As you know, I issued a report a couple months ago and presented to you on Term 91, the stored water bypass release requirements. I also presented that report to the Stewardship Council last month, and the next report I anticipate bringing before you probably in April will be on these gates and barriers in the Delta. It's kind of an interesting issue. It's a little bit outside my comfort zone because it's more technically oriented, but these projects are serving some useful purposes in trying to improve circulation, improve water quality in the Delta, and also keep the the fish out of the water supply corridors. And there's some existing projects, there's some ones on the drawing boards, and there's ones that are just kind of more in the future stages, but I hope to provide information on all those. It's kind of an interesting topic. So with that, I'll close unless you have any more questions.
Thank you, Craig. Mr. Howard, would you like to give your executive director's report? Portions thereof?
Just a couple of quick comments. One, last week I was ill and John testified on my behalf at a joint committee to discuss fracking issues. I don't know to what extent the board members would like any information on the interest the legislature has on that issue. I subsequently was speaking with Fran Pavley the next day when I had a meeting with her, and she has an expectation, and I think some of the other legislators do as well, that the Water Board needs to be more involved in fracking issues across the state. Presently, we have a MOU with Dogger, an MOA actually, with the Division of Oil and Gas, and And that pretty much says that, that the division will take care of the drilling and the disposal of, the actual construction of wells, plus the disposal of any oil field waste into Class 2 wells, and that would be handled by them, and that we deal with any sump issues out in the oil fields. But I think the principal interest that people have is water quality monitoring for fracking itself, which of course is quite problematic, because usually when we do water quality monitoring for groundwater activities, we're monitoring relatively shallow groundwater, and it's a surface activity that is the potential source of contamination. But now we're looking at very deep wells, and likely, if there is any contamination, it's down at the bottom of the aquifer, which makes drilling monitoring wells problematic. So we're not quite sure right now what we should be doing exactly, but we're going to be certainly cogitating on the issue over the next few months. And if the board would like any briefings or any further information, we'll try to make that available. John, did you have any comments about your testimony?
The other area that seemed to be of concern is on the what goes into these fracking operations and how to best make that information publicly available. And it looks like, though, they had some questions for me on that, that they are looking for DOGGR to require that disclosure of that information. But we'll see as it moves forward.
Well, this brings to mind that, there's been a number of areas in which we've been working recently where the issue of a regional monitoring program, a regional monitoring effort comes up. And, I don't know if something is, if we are going to have to do something because it becomes the law, being prepared as to what would be most useful, not just for the fracking issue, but for the region and the issues associated with the region would be important. And I mention this because I was just on a conference call with the regional boards, regional board staff, all of them, talking about salt disposal. And the question that was put to them was, how many examples do we have of deep well disposal of salt? And as it turns out, Region 3 had one example, but not many people were using that. Now, not saying that they should, but I'm just saying that that's another piece that is more directly in our sites than currently than is fracking. So we just need to be thinking about what we might want to know if we are in fact going to have to do more monitoring.
There was a little cheese plant somewhere in the valley that
That's
had
true. That is
deep
true.
water salt disposal.
And
kind of gummed up the works.
this is where, it becomes a little bit confusing between fracking and oil field operations and disposal, because they generate a lot of brine in the oil field operations. They put it right back into that formation. So there's a lot of deep disposal of salty brine that goes on, but it's part of their oil field operation. It's not regulated by us as a discharge of waste. Mm-hmm. And so, as you say, there's only a few examples where we've worked with DOGGR or with DTSC, depending on the situation, for deep well injection. There is lots of deep well disposal going on in the oil fields presently.
John, when you attended the hearing, was it clear whether their interest was on oil wells or natural gas wells as well? We had discussed that before you went over there.
Yes, their interest at this point was on oil wells, because that is where the fracking is going on currently in California. Though, as you're probably aware, a lot of the consternation around the country is on gas wells. Currently, according to Dogger's testimony, there is no fracking going on for gas wells in California. That's what they testified to at the hearing.
And so there again, the interest was in, I'm going back to the briefing that you and Karen gave me before you went over there, that there was concern about not the return of briny byproducts that were extracted and returned, but the addition of chemicals to essentially potable water, so they were sure of the chemical composition that they were injecting back into the ground. Did that turn out to be where their main emphasis was, or?
Yes, they had a couple issues related to that. One was the issue of what chemicals are being added, and disclosure of that information. And since currently Dogger doesn't require any reporting of what they use in the fracking operation. The other issue is a issue that's more tangent. Well, it's related to us. Is what is the source of the fresh water that they use, and is there a need to prioritize water use between municipal use, agricultural use, and oil field use, and so there were some questions related to that issue too, which may come up for us in any legislative activity.
The only other thing I wanted to briefly mention is that tomorrow the State Water Board's nitrate report will be released. We're presently working on a joint press release with the Department of Public Health, the Food and Ag, Department of Water Resources, us and the Governor's Office. The Governor's Office requested that we identify actions that we would start working on immediately and what other agencies would start working on immediately, and we've identified that we'd be looking to map nitrate high-risk areas around the state, and we would also convene the expert panel. That's one of the recommendations, to look at regulatory and non-regulatory measures for control of nitrate fertilizer application pollution problems. That's something, of course, that's being addressed presently in different ways in different regions through their WDRs or ag waivers. So we thought that the convening of an expert panel would be useful to have a chance to have a series of experts provide us some advice on what the most effective, cost-effective, and effective with respect to reduction of nitrate loads would be. So we're going to start those two activities right away.
Tom, you and I talked briefly when you gave me a heads up on this report and the timing, and I mentioned something, and the more I've thought about it, I like to think there's merit to it, and that is on this expert panel, there again, you had brought an example of what they were doing in Europe to deal with nitrate issues, which, unfortunately are indigenous to applications of fertilizer and always have been to one degree or another, always will be. But the Europeans were further ahead, if you will, than we are. If there was someone, and I realize the old adage of an expert, some SWRCB from out of town, so I guess if you get one from out of the country, he's really an expert. But to me, it would be interesting if we could research to see if there was someone that we could have on this expert panel that had specific expertise on what they're doing in Europe, rather than just, we're all grappling with a very difficult and very serious problem here, but if there was such a person available, I would think that would be a helpful addition to the expert panel.
Okay, thanks.
There's some work going on with nitrate removal at UCLA in the agricultural setting, at East Bay Mud, working. They're the test facility, working with Stanford and Berkeley. They're doing a lot of work with nitrate removal in the wastewater treatment world, testing both two devices that are used in Europe, one extensively and one somewhat, and then a new one that actually is going to have a fuel byproduct that could be sold. And so it's, so there are, I think, Charlie's absolutely right. It may be more in the kind of academic world that we'd find people who are doing some of this work. And I believe it's on the 1st of March. The UCLA person is going to be coming to the, we'll be at Cali, PA at 3 o'clock. And so make sure that you or John or someone is there.
Thank you. And that was all for now.
That's it.
Thank you.
We'll stand adjourned. Thank you all.
Where are you going?
Down to Mission Spring Water District. They're doing the groundbreaking septic to sewer, 1,000 plus septic.
Wow.
Septic to sewer. Or,
Yeah, they're getting off septic going on the sewer.
wow.
Getting 10 million from us. That's right. And then they're matching it.
And this is in Region 8?
Region 7.
7. Oh, great.
And then I'm between by Urban Water Institute.
Pardon?
Urban Water Institute. Water Energy Conference.
Ah, good. Good,
Since I'm in the neighborhood.
Absolutely, that's great.
I was in somebody was
Let us
speaking
know.
of your photographer. I was overwhelmed by photographers because
What's
it was
going on?
firefall. There was a
Yes,
firefall.
definitely. It's firefall season, yep.
Yeah, so I was there and all these guys were talking firefall and I was going,
They're
but I
really
thought
doing
that's what, well, no, it's not that. There's a place called Horsetail
Yeah,
Falls
it's
right
the-
by
the
El
color?
Capitan.
Yep.
And for about 2 days in February, because it just took away the sunset, it sort of lights up
Lights it up.
this fire, this.
Wow, I have a video of the old firefall.
Yeah, well, they have, I saw some pictures of it, and it wasn't, I mean, it was very interesting, but it wasn't, there wasn't enough water in the waterfall to get the, the really, because they had some pictures that just looked gorgeous, but we had, I got a few pictures, and, it was very beautiful, but it's just this.
How nice, was it really cold?
Oh, yeah.
Was it good?
Oh, yeah, it was warm up and stuff.
I bet when you walk outside in a little while, it's going to be colder than it was when you came in here. It looked cold.
Yeah, it looked ominous.
It was,
The only thing, you can put my name on that if you want, but if you would wordsmith the, some way about, instead, I realize that arsenic and nitrates were the major contaminants, but arsenic and other anthropogenic or naturally occurring subjects and nitrates or something to that effect.
Where are you talking about?
Right there. I mean, if we could,
Oh, yeah, this, but I'm talking about the line underneath.
oh, I thought, I was looking at the one you had paraphrased.
That's the quote is the line
so
underneath.
I will,
We're gonna
what,
change
about
that paragraph, that's what's
11:30?
more.
Okay, great.
Yeah, you can put my name on it if you want. But I would, whenever we,
Okay.
Their idea